Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about Boris Johnson. 80 years ago, the Royal Air Force and the British public were engaged in the fight of their life to save Britain from Nazi invaders. Britain had a great prime minister at the time, Winston Churchill, who made Britain one of the few countries in Western Europe which didn't fall to the Nazis. But the current prime minister, Boris Johnson, has a different idea. He wants to use the British military against their own citizenry. Boris is already using the police as stormtroopers, and now he wants to use the military as well. Boris says what he's doing is balanced and proportionate to protect health and jobs. The big fear is that the virus itself isn't balanced and proportionate, and that he could be repeating the error of March and waiting too long to impose tougher curbs. Let's look and see if Boris's beliefs have anything to do with reality. This is the United Kingdom daily COVID death curve. You can see that it peaked in mid-April and has been declining ever since. Boris has convinced himself that the reason deaths started declining in mid-April was because he imposed draconian lockdowns. But the real reason was that the British government had already killed off most of the vulnerable people in nursing homes by sending sick people into the nursing homes and infecting them. Well over half of the deaths in the UK were in nursing homes. And here's some evidence showing that Boris is completely wrong. Sweden has almost exactly the same shaped curve as the UK, peaking in mid-April with deaths declining ever since. But Sweden never locked down, they never mandated masks, they never took their kids out of school, they never closed their restaurants and bars. The reason that deaths started declining in mid-April in both the UK and Sweden was because the country started to achieve herd immunity. The virus was having a harder and harder time finding new people to infect and kill. But Boris imagines himself to be a god and believes that he controlled the virus by locking the country down, even though Sweden showed unequivocally that lockdowns are not necessary and that deaths were going to decline regardless of what Boris Johnson did. Boris says that he needs to stop the increase in cases which has been occurring over the last 2 months ever since he issued the mask mandate. This graph shows UK cases in blue and deaths in red. The y-axis of the red deaths curve is greatly exaggerated. I've done this in order to make it easier to see, but obviously the number of deaths is actually much lower than the number of cases. So back in March and April, the cases curve in blue was closely followed by the death curve in red. There was only a short lag between cases and deaths. During the first wave of coronavirus back in March and April, there was pretty close correlation between cases and deaths. But now during the second wave, there's no correlation at all. Whatever this second wave is, it's not a particularly deadly virus. But Boris says he needs to stop it even if he has to use the military against the British public. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail reports today, has Sweden beaten coronavirus? Expert claims by refusing to shut the country down, the Swedes now have herd immunity and have avoided a second wave. Sweden has beaten coronavirus by refusing to shut the country down and achieving herd immunity, according to an expert. The Scandinavian nation was the only country in Europe not to introduce strict lockdown measures at the start of the pandemic. But scientists believe this may have helped it avoid a second wave of COVID-19, as it continues to record its lowest number of cases since March, with just 28 infections per 100,000 people. This figure is less than half of the UK's own infection rate of 69 per 100,000 people. If this is true, the implication is that Boris is making exactly the same mistake which he made back in March, only this time he's bringing the military into it as well. 80 years ago was Britain's finest hour.
In a special message of congratulation to the Fighter Command, Mr. Churchill says the results they have obtained give us just confidence in the approaching struggle. These are some of the pilots, Canadians, who are daily hurling Spitfire, Hurricane or Defiant into the masses of Nazis continue to be sent against us. Hitler hopes to gain the mastery of the air, but so long as the British Empire breeds men like these, it is Britain who will gain and hold the mastery. The Fighter Command has already performed wonders, and at every alarm it gains fresh glory. Germany's morning hate in this war takes the form of massed aerial attacks on the defences of London. So this is now a familiar sight and a familiar sound. At regular hours, the Nazi bombers come over, heavily protected by fighters. You can clearly see the Messerschmitts maneuvering above the bombers. But in spite of the number of Nazi planes, the whole nation has complete confidence in our own fighters, and with good reason. Our Hurricanes and Spitfires, day after day, are breaking up the Nazi formations and shooting down Nazi planes by the score. This, too, is a familiar sound, the sound of a British fighter returning in triumph to its base. Another of the most familiar sights in the country, Nazi planes crashed and broken. Hitler's morning strafe turned to ashes.
But now Boris Johnson is using the military against their own people. There are currently 1,261 patients with COVID in hospitals in England, which is a little bit more than one per hospital. Back in March, it was claimed that lockdowns were needed to keep the hospitals from getting overloaded, but that's clearly not the case now. There's a different agenda at work now, and it has nothing to do with protecting the hospitals. I moved to England in 1969 during a pandemic which was much deadlier than the current COVID pandemic. About twice as many people died in Britain from the Hong Kong flu as did from COVID-19. This was a picture I took in London right after I arrived in 1969. You'll notice that the girl does not have a mask on. It was a deadlier pandemic than the current one, but nobody was talking about a pandemic. Most people didn't even know about it. This was the Queen riding side saddle at her birthday celebration 50 years ago. England was a very proud country at that time, proud of how they had defeated the Nazis. But things are different now with Boris Johnson. This is a cartoon that's in the Telegraph today. Boris Johnson is a joke, but he's a dangerous one. He's using the military against the British people. One of my favorite authors, Edward Abbey, said, "The tragedy of modern war is that the young men die fighting each other instead of their real enemies back home in the capitals." Toto is not very impressed by what's going on in the UK right now. Boris Johnson has managed to make a complete farce out of his tenure. He obviously doesn't understand the science, and nothing he's doing makes any sense. Toto has spent the last 12 years pulling back the curtain on this sort of insanity and junk science. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.